Oh, recording
Yep.
started. Fabulous. Well. I am here today with
Yes.
Elliot to discuss, Lovecraft and also all the interesting philosophical sides of his sort of body of literature, his life and whatnot. Elliot, do you want to share a little bit about yourself and, your sort of like interests relating to this topic, how you got into all of it?
Thanks, Ryan. Well, I'm Elliot. I'm an undergrad film student at the University of Warwick. I've been a massive horror fan, specifically like classic, but at the same time kind of more obscure horror literature since I was about 13 or 14. Well, I was always into like ghosts and dark stuff from a really young age. I'd always, when I was very young, I'd always seek out specifically the scariest episodes of Scooby-Doo or whatever to watch. Then when I got a little bit older, got say 12, 10, I started getting really interested in like things like Most Haunted and some of those discovery programs with like a haunting or whatever that were kind of reenactments of supposed real world haunting events. And when I think I was 10, I was at the Isle of Wight, and my mum mentioned a writer called M.R. James, and she told me a lot about him. So did my grandparents, my mum's mum. And then a few years later, when I was 13, I watched a program called M.R. James Ghostwriter, which is a brilliant documentary about M.R. James as a writer who's kind of the one of the most important ghost story writers and horror writers of the late 19th and early 20th century that Britain's ever produced. One of his stories, Casting the Runes, was a very similar idea, and possibly even I think actually Ramsey Campbell, who's another horror writer, contemporary horror writer though, has said in an interview that it was the inspiration for the film Ringu, or The Ring, about the idea of it's a curse being put onto you, but you can put it off onto someone else by showing them whatever the cursed artifact is that you've been shown. And I was really into him for years. And then from him, I got into H.P. Lovecraft and also Robert W. Chambers. And then that's kind of when my affinity for horror and like the horror literature kind of went more away from the classic ghost story to more this idea of existential cosmic horror. This idea of cosmicism and the ancient worlds beyond human comprehension, but that have filtered down through comparative human mythology, like different legends from across the worlds, or different cryptids, different mythologies, all coming up with the same ideas. Like, for instance, the dragon is something that's appeared in almost every single culture, and it's really interesting, this idea of the serpentine fire breather, the flying serpentine fire breather at that, is something that has appeared in Chinese mythology, ancient European mythology, ancient Greek mythology had their own variants with like Scylla, the sea serpent, or the Hydra, and so on and so forth. And this idea of perhaps there may be some truth in the monsters of the subconscious that we see turning up all over the world, and beyond that even, that maybe beyond what we see in the world, there may be a hierarchy going up and up and up and up. And that's what's kind of the crux of cosmic horror. It's this idea of there's a bigger fish out there. Because like in a lot of Lovecraftian stories, you will encounter something which seems utterly incomprehensible. Like, Ryan, how much do you want me to go into? Like, I won't go into too much of spoilers of the stories, except when it kind of wants to illustrate a point. Because, like, there's one story which I think you read recently. You said called "The Haunter of the Dark."
Yeah.
Yeah, where the monster in it's kind of like this flying dragon-like beast that is summoned by a strange and ancient artifact. But that may seem insane and ultra powerful and beyond human comprehension. But beyond that, there are things like Dagon, Cthulhu, and the great old ones, who are the things that are so big and so large and so ancient that humanity is nothing to them but insects, and they've been around for millions of years on this planet. But beyond that, there are things beyond the stars which are so much more powerful. The distinction is, like, as powerful as something like Dagon is to humans, Dagon is as insignificant to the outer gods as humans are to Dagon. And then beyond that, there is even more. And it's this idea of there's always a bigger fish, there's always something bigger. It's like ants, mice, cats, humans, elephants, and all that sort of thing, but in a more cosmic idea of like worlds beyond our understanding. And it's not just the idea of planets beyond our solar system, as is in most sci-fi. It's also this idea of dimensions beyond our dimensions, and the fact that there might be an infinite set of realities. And if that's the case, what's our relation to them? Like, how does that make, how significant does that make us? How significant does that make humans? And quite a lot of the time, I think in Lovecraftian fiction, it's the horror comes from like two things, I'd probably say. One is, how insignificant are we? Second is, how are we even able to comprehend what's out there? Like, it's so beyond our comprehension, if we even try, we'd go mad. It's like, I don't know, try and picture infinity. You can't do it, and if you tried, you'd go mad. Or like, if you tried to count to 1 billion, it'd take you about 30 years to do so.
Yeah, no, interesting. And yeah, I think sort of from my sort of brief exploration into sort of Lovecraft and his sort of philosophical outlook of cosmicism, I think it is sort of, you know, it speaks to the sort of confrontation really of like the limits of comprehension, and like how the depths of the unknown unknowns are, you know, it creates, like you say, it's a sort of this infinite space. And I suppose sort of as science progresses and stuff like that, there is a sort of sense that, you know, we can generate these sort of very sophisticated models of reality, like the physical laws, you know, we postulate these various constants and stuff like that, and we forget that they are aspects of our models of reality, you know. And whilst they sort of allow us to make very, very good predictive inferences regarding reality or nature and whatnot, and generate all sorts of sophisticated technologies and stuff, you know, there is a sort of you only need to sort of take a brief look at quantum mechanics and you know, the strangeness of what we find there, and as well when we zoom out and consider more astrological, cosmological phenomena and confront stuff like dark matter, which is basically phenomena which moves in such a way that does not cohere with our current understandings of gravity and stuff like that. So it's like we're constantly butting heads with the mystery, and the mystery that is your own perception as well, you know. And you know, that mystery can be very awe-inspiring, but you know, in the case of like horror, it's like you can take the imagination, and Lovecraft seems to sort of create these very deep stories. Sorry, I'm just getting a buzzing phone call at the moment in my pocket, and it's distracting me.
It's all right.
But yeah, it's like, I think it's interesting to sort of, you know, because this whole question of extraterrestrials, I mean, there's as far as I'm aware, like increased discourse on like UFO phenomena and whatnot, and you know, a sort of, I mean, and UFO, extraterrestrials, you know, or interdimensional entities and whatnot, they've always been sort of a sort of a feature of human discourse. Maybe in earlier times we would refer to them as like fairies and whatnot. And like you mentioned before, like the conversation, you talked about sort of how dragons appear in a very diverse range of different mythologies across the world, and dragons, of course, you know, I can't remember the word you describe it as, serpent-like.
Oh yeah,
fire-breathing.
serpentine, fire-breathing, and usually flying in almost every single mythology. Even Mesoamerican mythology, and South American, ancient South American mythology speaks of the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatlus, and then in the Native American mythology, there's the thunderbird, which is very similar to the dragon, only more feathered rather than the classic serpent image. But it's this idea of everyone's been running from something flying about the clouds, shooting fire out of its mouth.
And I guess sort of, in a way, it's a representation, kind of. It's relative to a human sort of mode of understanding. You know, much of our representations of aliens or powerful higher up entities, it's always initially they'll be relative to our representation, and then it's like with Lovecraft, the monsters, you know, the monsters are in such that you simply cannot comprehend it at all. You know, you cannot filter it into your finite human perceptual module, and it's like so yeah, and it's sort of, and I guess that's what makes it so existential in that sort of sense. I mean, as far as I'm, from the little I sort of have dipped my toes into it, and because yeah, there's, you know, when, sorry about that. So yeah, I suppose sort of, you know, tell me a little bit about what sort of monsters, because I'm aware there's a Cthulhu mythos, and you're mentioning some names earlier about the sort of a hierarchy of beings and stuff like that, and so I suppose, like, to orient sort of like listeners and stuff like that, you know, we can sort of go a bit into that. You can, but yeah.
I'd love to, mate. Well, in terms of the hierarchy, it's kind of faint at times to understand, but there are some concrete elements to it. And like, thing is to understand is that Lovecraft, an awful lot of what he was writing was based on another guy called Robert W. Chambers, specifically his style of cosmic and weird fiction. And even he was based a lot of his work on another guy called Ambrose Bierce. And the character they spoke of the most is the one I'd like to talk about first. He's probably, other than Cthulhu, he's going to be the most well known to a lot of people. He's called the King in Yellow, or Hastur, which is his name, but his title is the King in Yellow. And he was very famously adapted in the series True Detective, or the first series of True Detective anyway, which is totally about this whole idea of the grand unknown and humanity's kind of crushing insignificance in relation to it. Matthew McConaughey basically spends the entire series doing monologues about the boundless and the endless, and how humanity is kind of an insignificant force in it all. And Woody Harrelson, who's like his partner, when he gets like exposed to the case they're working on, which has a definite sort of occult and cosmic horror leaning to it, he starts to essentially lose his cool and become much more unstable. His relationship with his wife breaks down because of it. He starts drinking heavily. He starts to get pulled down with Rust Cohle, who's Matthew McConaughey's character, into this spiral. And what's interesting as well is McConaughey's character, Rust Cohle. He had previously had a history with psychedelic drugs, and because of that, he has sporadic hallucinations, which kind of melds which kind of is one of the most interesting parts of the show. It's this idea of, is what he's seeing just in his imagination caused by the drugs, or has the drugs kind of allowed him to pierce the veil and see beyond it? Because all the members of the cult that they're investigating are hocked up all the time, and they say this is how we see through the veil. This is how we see into the other dimension. And the character of the King in Yellow is really interesting because he's very, unlike a lot of the others who are more concrete in their understanding of them. The character of the King in Yellow's more amorphous and more, it's like, I suppose more sublime is the word for it. It's like we don't quite know. His motives are never really explained in the literature, and he's just this force of immense power. In the first story he was ever mentioned in, he was just called Hastur, and it was in the film called Haisha the Shepherd by Ambrose Bierce. And then who also wrote a story called The Inhabitant of Carcosa, and then in the King in Yellow saga, which I actually have a copy of right here by my bed, by Robert W. Chambers. He talks about how Hastur is the King in Yellow and the ruler of this city of Carcosa, but that's all that's really explained. And the thing is, everyone who's come into contact with him originally first and foremost comes into contact with him from a book, a manuscript for a play called The King in Yellow, which, if you read it, it technically drives you mad, because the information you subjected yourself to is beyond human comprehension. For that reason, the entity of Hastur is not as he's not necessarily as overtly malevolent as the others. It's more about how the human mind reacts when it comes into contact with something like that. Like electricity is not malevolent, but if you touch like a live wire, you're gonna get overcome because it's so powerful. And that's kind of the crux of each of the stories in the anthology of The King in Yellow. Everyone who comes into contact with the story becomes overpowered, but in very different ways. And it depends on how they are as a person in general. Like, if they're a more good character, how they interact with the King in Yellow usually ends up with a slightly better outcome for them. In fact, in one of the stories, it kind of helps the guy more than anything else. But in another one, he's already a bit of a control freak and a power mad maniac, and he tries to create a plot to overthrow the US government. It's called The Repairer of Reputations. It's a really good story. It's like a great political thriller as well as a horror. And so that's the character of Hastur, and I suppose that's probably the Lovecraftian entity I find the most interesting. Actually, rather than doing a dissertation for my degree, I'm making a short film, and it's an adaptation of one of the stories from the book, which is, the best way I can describe that one is, there's a condition called Stannard syndrome, which is really interesting. They even made a horror film / murder mystery about it at one point. And it's basically what it is you become overpowered and physically overpowered simply from relation to profound artwork. Like, if you see a profound painting or hear a profound piece of music, it can cause you physical distress that's in some ways detrimental to you. And the point of this story, which is called In the Court of the Dragon, is about a man who listens to a piece of music being played in a church on an organ, and it sends him mad. But through that madness, he's able to pierce the veil and see into the other dimensions. And that's kind of the bread and butter that Lovecraft based a lot of his work on. The other more famous character from the Lovecraftian pantheon is Cthulhu, the tentacle-y man, the kind of the face of what everyone thinks when they think of Lovecraft, and he's actually Hastur's half-brother and mortal enemy. And what's interesting about him is he's a more evidently malevolent entity, when he's described, his motives are described outright. What he is he's basically he's been trapped on the planet Earth in kind of a spaceship slash city, and at some point when the planets realign, him and his entire group of what are called the Starspawn, which are basically his army trapped below the ocean, will be able to take off and return home. But in doing so, they need all of humanity to make the world ready for them. And when that happens, the very act of escaping the Earth's atmosphere will destroy the world and kill every living creature on it. So what it's basically about is Cthulhu has been influencing humanity mostly through their dreams to create their own extinction by making the world ready for his departure. And what's very similar is it's kind of similar in structure to the King in Yellow as a book in general, because it's all about how different people have interacted with Cthulhu and Cthulhu's influence. Like, for instance, an anthropologist finds, well, actually, no, what it is like a police officer who did a raid in this very, very violent, debauched ritual going on in Louisiana, recovered this idol of Cthulhu, and he takes it to an anthropologist who says, yeah, I found a similar idol in like Alaska, and a bunch of people were doing a blood sacrifice to it. And another guy who gets subjected to it, he has dreams of these strange artifacts and towers and artwork and so on and so forth, which is evidently comes from Cthulhu. And he starts to like make it out of clay and show it to an anthropologist and say, like, what does this mean? Does this look recognizable to you? And he goes, well, not that it looks recognizable, but I see echoes of it throughout different civilizations. And I suppose those are the two most comparable characters in terms of not just not just in terms of like their fame and their influence in the genre, because they keep cropping up all over the place, but also in terms of like how they interacted with humanity within the stories. Of course, the one being like, because Lovecraft was a little unlike Robert W. Chambers, who was a bit more ambiguous. Lovecraft was a bit more piled on heavily that these things are pure evil and so on and so forth with all of his characters. Like, he piled on the existential dread a bit more. So Cthulhu was a more evidently and obviously evil entity. But like beyond that, one of the more interesting characters is like going beyond Cthulhu to, say, the outer gods. And it's not really, a lot of people say Haster's a great old one, like one of the more earthbound ones, but I don't think he is. He seems a little bit more omnipotent than a lot of the other more earthbound ones. So he might, in all honesty, be more of an outer god. And like in terms of the outer gods, they are basically sentient galaxies quite a lot of the time. Like, one of the more famous is Yog-Sothoth, and a lot of people refer to the Lovecraft canon as the Yog-Sothology because of how powerful Yog-Sothoth is. He's the record keeper of all time and space throughout every universe. Like, everything that ever happened, he knows about, and he's like kept a record of, and he's described as being like this utterly, almost like infinite mass of bubbling, flashing lights, kind of like, as I say, like a sentient galaxy sort of thing, like a mass of stars and pulsating nebulas that knows everything about the universe or the multiverse from its conception up to its end, which is very different to what is considered by most to be the central god of the Lovecraftian pantheon, which is Azathoth, or also referred to as the blind idiot god, who is a god who is sleeping, and his dreams are the universe, and when he wakes up, the world will end. Everything that ever existed will end, because it was his dreams all along. And what's really interesting about that is that kind of ties into the Gnostic understanding, or the Gnostic idea of what God actually was. The Gnostics believed that the God of the material world, they called it the demiurge or Samael, which literally translates to blind idiot God, or the blind God. And they believed that was a false God who was asleep, and his dreams or his thoughts made the real world, and if he woke up, everything would end. It's very similar also to in Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland. They talk about the Red King, who is a sleeping king, and at one point, in one adaptation of it, Tweedledee and Tweedledum and Alice run into the Red King, and then she says, "What's he dreaming about?" And they say to her, "He's dreaming about you and me, and if he wakes up, we won't be here anymore." And it's a rather interesting idea. I suppose that's the crux of all of cosmic horror in terms of how insignificant we all are. Do we even exist at all? And if so, how important is our existence compared to, say, like something so much bigger that could wipe us out by waking up?
No, I mean, it's interesting, the depiction of, the most powerful, entity as also the one that you say like an idiot almost, and it's an interesting sort of, I don't know, it triggered an interesting sort of synergy in my thought of like, I don't know, in Taoism, the Chinese philosophy, for example, is that it's a depiction of the sort of, the Tao, or this, cosmic force. It's depicted almost only with like words, these pointers really to something that cannot be put in words ultimately, but they point to the sort of the Tao as being, so empty of thought that almost as the mind of an idiot. There's a certain phrase which sort of points to that, really, and there's obviously the idea of how we are all sort of the emanations from this thing, which is, like you say, sort of, it's like it's described as an idiot, as something empty of thought, empty of all rationality of anything, and it's yeah, I suppose it's sort of, maybe it's sort of, to call it an idiot is the wrong sort of word to use. It's just it's devoid of any intellectual contents or any intellectual properties, I suppose. But yeah,
and that's actually an interesting point you make about whether or not it's right to call it an idiot, because here's the thing. H.P. Lovecraft was an ardent nihilist, to the point that he had such a he had an ardent distrust of everything, and he thought nothing was sacred, almost to the point that you can actually look at the Lovecraftian pantheon of gods as almost like this dark inversion of the Abrahamic tradition of gods. And you can even look at some of the depictions of his entities from the sort of chimeric humanoid with animal heads and wings low-level gods, and then you've got the spinning wheels and strange lights of the outer gods, and then a central god who's the ruler of them all. It's also very similar to an awful lot of ancient biblical depictions of the angels, because like it's kind of a bit of a thing on the internet that a lot of people, a lot of videos on biblically accurate angels, and I find that a really interesting thing to look at as well, because these ones, if you look at them, like say there's the Ophanim, which are like spinning wheels of metal with flashing lights and great big eyes and so on and so forth, or the cherubim, who in a lot of the artwork are like little babies with fluttering wings, whereas in the actual depictions, like from a lot of the biblical accounts, they describe them as having grand wings and animal heads, and multiple animal heads actually, with a central human head at the front of it, and so on and so forth. But it's this idea, I suppose, a lot of the Lovecraftian, the proper Lovecraftian element is to see it all as a force of malevolence, which he kind of saw everything as, because he was such an ardent nihilist. He also gradually began to lose a lot of his nihilism as he went along in his life, however, and a lot of his books and his later books seem far less bitter and cruel. Like some of his earlier ones, he even disavowed because they were written before he even started writing, like the Cthulhu Mythos sort of stories, and they were like undisguised propaganda for some of his very bigoted and anti-everything, anti-humanity, anti-immigration, anti-women's points of view, which he completely started to move away from, surprisingly, actually, after he got married. But I suppose a lot of when you look at it like that, and like how in the King and Yellow saga, it's a far less overtly malevolent depiction of an outer god.
Some connection
and like
issues at the moment.
Sorry.
Starting.
Cool, fantastic.
Cool. Fabulous. Well, apologies for technical difficulties, gang, but we're back.
We're back indeed.
Yeah, we're back indeed.
Yes.
Yeah, we'll just
what was I saying? That was it. I remember what I was saying. It was yes, H.P. Lovecraft was a crushing nihilist, and that was, I suppose, the main distinction between, say, his depictions of outer gods and so on and so forth, and the more Robert W. Chambers' King in Yellow depiction, which was to Lovecraft it was all evil and everything was dark and horrible and nothing was good and so on and so forth. Whereas with Chambers, his work was a little bit more, it's up to interpretation, or it's up to the person who interacts with it. And in that way, I suppose it kind of ties into the understanding of how do certain people experience certain things, and do their presuppositions and predispositions for certain things cause them to have an understanding which is wildly different to say someone else with more of an optimistic view on the situation. And what's interesting as well is, as it went along, a lot of his characters who were more outright evil in earlier stories, like the characters of the ghouls, which are a kind of werewolf creatures that are kept alive by eating the flesh of the dead in earlier stories. In later stories, and particularly his dream cycle stories, like Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, are actually much more benevolent and kind creatures, or even like central figures of the plot and central good guys who help the main character Randolph Carter on his quest, and are really like the actual story of Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath is probably one of the best fantasy stories you'll ever read. It's really high fantasy. A lot of it kind of plays out like a D&D campaign, because it's about like this traveler who goes from different realms in what is known as the dream world, which is this place that we can all access when we go to sleep, and it's a full codified world with nations, boundaries, borders, and a lot of the stories are about a lot of the things that he does in the story are like he meets an old wise merchant or ship captain in a tavern, and he has to drink with him and smoke with him and wheedle some information out of him before traveling on his journey, meeting a kindly old man who tells him something and then uses that information to progress, and then he has to fight some sort of horrible monstrous beast out in the plains and so on and so forth. And a lot of that was actually influenced by other earlier writers like Lord Dunsinane, and apparently even some of the works of William Morris, which is rather interesting. I myself created my own fantasy lore, and I actually have a YouTube channel for explaining it. First couple of videos are up on there, and but a couple of others are going down the pipe, which is very much this idea of high fantasy with a Lovecraftian mythos behind it, and this idea of everything filtering down from the outer gods and the elder gods and things older than humanity, going down to the more grounded mythological creatures like titans, gods, goddesses, the Olympians, and then eventually to humanity and cyclopses, minotaurs, and so on and so forth. And like for this one, I kind of noted that a lot of comparable mythology from different ancient mythologies not only pertain to each other, they pertained to Lovecraftian ideas. So it was this idea of mixing Greek mythology, Babylonian mythology, and Lovecraftian mythos into one. I called and like what was really fun with that as well was coming up with the different realms of existence and coming up with the different say titles for it. And I call this saga the Aesopian Chronicles. Wonder if we could like put a link to that for any of the
Yeah.
I don't want to go into I don't want to go into full detail on all of the because it's like a 20-minute video, and that's just the first part of it. And like I've been working on the second part, which is like going to be half an hour to 40 minutes long, and that's only the second part of it. It's going to take quite a while to finish. But yeah, if any of the viewers are interested, they can check that out. But like what was really interesting was trying to create the different opposing realms. And like Aesopia is like the material realm, or rather the area within the material realm that the gods of Earth inhabit. It's basically this idea of Earth. And beyond that, there's the material realm of Henosis, which is just everything that's solid and tangible. And beyond that, there is the abyss of Lethe, where nothing is tangible, nothing is understandable. It's basically primordial space. It's a realm so ancient that it doesn't pertain to any of the laws of the classical universe. It's basically it's sort of the understanding dark matter or antimatter. And I suppose my mother is very interested in quantum mechanics, and an awful lot of that is filtered down to me. And what's really interesting is an awful lot of, as you were saying earlier about quantum mechanics, mapping out the universe, but then there are aspects that are either too obscure or insane to actually for the layman and to grasp, and so it starts to enact this notion of cosmic horror. And even beyond that, there are some things that are so inexplicable that if you attempt to comprehend them, you would go mad. And actually, what's interesting is Immanuel Kant would call that would refer to that as the sublime. It's this idea of, to him, unlike Burke, for whom the sublime was when the senses are challenged by like some empirical force, like natural disasters, extreme light, something that you couldn't necessarily explain but you feel. Kant takes that a step further and says the sublime is something that happens entirely in the mind. It's essentially when imagination fails. Like, you can come up with a codified concept of something, but then there are some things that are so inexplicable, like the idea of the infinite, that you can come up with an idea of it, a very amorphous idea of it, but you cannot codify it as a proper concept. You cannot write it down. You cannot map its coordinates. You cannot write down its measurements or its chemical content or its geography or its history or so on and so forth. And given that, it becomes something that you have to purely imagine. But when some things are so obscure that you can't even imagine them, it's a sense of total annihilation of human faculties. When it's something you cannot imagine, cannot you cannot rationalize. What's even stranger is you cannot see or touch it or feel it or understand it. That is something that will enact the most unimaginable horror upon you.
And I think sort of, yeah, this is sort of cropping up lots of sort of psychedelic sort of notions for me, kind of, particularly when it's sort of tapped into how, you know, our mind, you know, in sort of general ordinary sober consciousness, it's, you know, it can only represent a certain kind of world that's obviously sort of idiosyncratic to, you know, what sort of observer is it, what's like, we're human observers and whatnot, and also within each different human observer we all have different lives and different developmental cycles. And I think this also goes back to what you were talking about earlier, I suppose, in terms of what's the you know, how different people respond to cosmic horror, for example, and how sort of Lovecraft's sort of his body of work, particularly at the earlier sort of books and whatnot, was far more nihilistic, you sort of say, whereas you use a counterexample. What's the author who your film is based on? I've forgotten.
Robert W. Chambers.
Robert Chambers. You sort of mentioned that his sort of interpretation is, you know, not quite as nihilistic, I suppose, and stuff like that. And I suppose it's interesting to speculate on, say, you know, Lovecraft sort of what aspects of his life, his childhood, for example, may have contributed to a much more nihilistic sort of response to the contemplation of the infinite, or the contemplation of, you know, what lies beyond the bounds of our understanding. And you know, because, you know, like some people may you know, lots of religious and mystical kind of experiences, you know, often involve, say, a sort of a kind of experiential encounter with that, you know, you don't will it into action. It's something that very much takes you and dissolves your conceptions of self. And, you know, this can be a very sort of arresting experience, you know, to be immersed within this power, which is, or this anything beyond the familiar, you know. And
Totally.
and that's like sort of very axiomatic of the psychedelic kind of experience. And there's obviously connections here with meditation, any sort of contemplative technique or practice for seeing deeper into reality. But this seeing deeper is a sort of a turning inwards, I suppose, you know. And you know, psychedelics, for example, you know, there's such a vast variety of them out in nature. We're obviously synthesizing more and more as time progresses and whatnot. But I suppose the sort of the central feature is, of course, that capacity to dissolve boundaries, to dissolve the models that we often frame and engage with reality with. And when those models are sort of dissolved, or they're shown to be sort of unreal in a certain way, you know, the type of consciousness that one comes into in that sort of very dissolved state is one of very, deep fixation or deep presence with the present moment. You know, it's very much sort of similar to sort of, say, an infant's perception or a child's perception. There's a kind of perception where the weight of history is, you know, it's been extinguished, and then you're just there with what is. And, you know, it's and when you're there with what is, you know, this can be a very sort of, the whole transition into it of ego dissolution, when that sort of the ego structure, or say someone's identity structure, is resisting this sort of dissolving into nothingness, that can create all sorts of strange energetic sensations, can be very uncomfortable and whatnot. And I think that's a psychedelic experience, but, you know, what we're talking about in this cosmic horror, you know, which, you know, tied into the philosophy of nihilism, you know, philosophy, you know, contemplation to reality can, you know, take one's mind into all sorts of different places, and, you know, both which are, you know, perhaps more or less functional for daily living. You know, it's interesting. Nihilism is sort of, you know, I mean, I sort of feel it's an interpretation of the isness of reality, that it suggests that there is no meaning to it. You know, it's you know, and of course, you know, we are sort of, it's a kind of interpretation of isness, I suppose, because, you know, there is nothing you can really, you know, people often sort of would try and derive their meaning from the present moment by referring, say, to some future state of endeavors. You know, a lot of sort of self-enhancement, a lot of the cultural goals that we sort of think of ourselves as, you know, when people are living for the future, for example, but yeah, I don't know if we'll go. Yeah, it's difficult. It is difficult to sort of.
I think what you said there is actually really interesting. It's made me think of a few things. They're a bit of a. It's going to go down a bit of a weird route, because I'm going to go from H.P. Lovecraft to the Ryan Reynolds film Free Guy with it, but it's going to be it's going to seem like a bit of a jump, but I'll try and see if I can make it work. Like, what's really interesting about that is the idea of nihilism appears to be, to me, it's people who it's experienced by people who see their world has no meaning, but are so wrapped with grief over its lack of meaning that all they do is grieve about the lack of meaning.
Mm.
It's like H.P. Lovecraft was a boy he was a very sickly child from Boston who never fit in with any of the other children, even there, but really loved the sort of rural New England towns and villages and old foresty areas. And then when he went to New York, he was horrified by the amount of people who were there, the amount of noise, the multiculturalism. It upset him on a sensory level. Because he was so used to more quiet and removed life. But what's really interesting about that is that level of sort of what appears to be sensory annoyance of something that is far more hustly and bustly and far more populated and far more built up and so on and so forth, appears to have informed his entire opinions on life in general. It's just this idea of this constant feeling of fear and disgust at all of his surroundings. It's kind of comparable in many ways to Franz Kafka's childhood, although Kafka perhaps had a little bit more of a definite of a say an unpleasant childhood, especially at the hands of his father and so on and so forth. But it's this idea of being the sickly child who never fit in, being thrust into a world which is far more overbearing, and that level of terror and sensory confusion is what led to a sense of nihilism and a sense of being crushed by a great and unknowable force around you. And a lot of that, what you were saying about living in the present moment, makes me think of this of an awful lot of Buddhist teaching and meditation is how to deal with this living in the present moment, even if it is painful or annoying or noisome or sensoriously affecting to you. Like, I have autism myself, and I've had to essentially use an awful lot of these meditative techniques that my mother taught me. She actually she's writing at the moment a book, has written a small a small book on the certain sciences, the scientific reasons behind a lot of ancient meditative techniques and so on and so forth, with a lot of which actually was accrued from the sort of stuff that she learned while researching autism and how to help break someone who is autistic out of sensory overload and so on and so forth. And what I've started to realize as you go along is the world may be meaningless, but the world's only as meaningfully cruel as you allow it to be to you. And one of the things that's really interesting about that is that in the Ryan Reynolds film Free Guy, there's a moment where he realizes he's a computer game character. He was created as a computer game character, and he becomes horribly depressed because he thinks that he is insignificant, that there are things beyond him that have created him, that he is just a toy to gods, effectively, which are the humans, the game developers who made him. And then his best friend turns up to his house and sits with him, and he says to him, "I'm not real. How can you be okay with this when you've just realized you're not real?" And so his friend sits there and says to him, "Well, I may not be real, but I know this moment's real. I'm sitting with my best friend and I'm helping him through a tough time. If that's not real, I don't know what is." It's this idea of you're going to realize down the line that you are only momentary. You are only you're a very short-living biological entity in a world where there are trees that are older than the Constitution of America, or even there are trees that are in this country that are older than the Angles, Saxons, and Celts who came here. And then when you think of that and think of how long ago those guys lived and how long a human lives for, it seems finite. But that's only ever as terrifying to you as you'll allow it to be. Sometimes, like the story of the King in Yellow, what I really connected with it is it's not about people who encounter the great unknown and they go mad from it and crawl up into a little ball and realize, oh, everything's terrible. I'm meaningless. It's usually about people who, in fact, the crux of the King in Yellow is it's not cosmic horror, it's cosmic rapture. It's this idea of the horror comes from the extreme beauty of seeing something like that. Like, I don't know, if you ever, the first time you ever saw, say, a nebula or the concept of a black hole, or realized that the sun was not some, badly drawn little yellow circle with like lines around the edges as it's drawn in primary school, but is actually a fireball so large that if the earth were the size of a pea, the sun would be the size of a beach ball. When you come across something like that, it's crushing, it's terrifying. The fact that it's going to die at some point is terrifying to you. But at the same time, it's awe-inspiring. It's so powerful, it's so grand, it's so miraculous, it's so marvelous. And then when you realize something like that is so miraculous and marvelous, you realize that however insignificant you are in comparison to it, the fact that you're a product of it, and the fact that you're irrevocably tied to it as a cosmic entity in of itself, you see that there is a miracle in there within you. You look at the flowers in a slightly different way. You think of, say, those things, the flower, forget-me-not, one of the smallest flowers you can find, though a very beautiful flower, exists primarily on the energy cast down out of the sky by a colossal, eternally raging ball of fire. And then when you realize that, nothing seems insignificant anymore. Everything seems slightly more important. Even the more momentary things seem slightly more important.
Mm.
And even the fact that it ends at some point is there's a line by the famous comedian Bill Hicks, who was more than just a comedian, he was kind of a philosopher as well as a stand-up comic.
Yeah.
He used to say at the end of
Yeah.
I love Bill Hicks. He's probably my favorite stand-up comic, actually, but also like one of my favorite people. Like
Some
one of his
stuff about drugs, for example, hilarious.
exactly, yeah. Like, what was it the one about when the cops pulled him over while he was on LSD, and he said, "Yeah, we were turning into fish, and cops don't like fish driving around in cars." But yeah, he goes on this whole thing about drugs, and then like says, "Oh, the news, it's all so negative all the time. I mean, doesn't the news just say give a story? Here's a story. Someone took a strip of LSD, and they came to the conclusion that there is no death. We're all connected irrevocably in a great circle of life, and everything's eternal, and the only thing that matters is love. And now the weather." Which is kind of my and also his ending point that he'd always do for all of his stand-up routines, which is, it's just a ride. And there are people who'll go, "No, it can't be a ride. Look at all the things I've got. I've got a bank account and I've got a house." No, it's just a ride.
Yeah.
And what's interesting about that is when you find that out, this idea of crushing nihilism and depression and, oh, nothing means anything, it's a disaster, everything's awful, we should all sit around and mope and feel sorry for each other and sit in the corner and whip ourselves like 14th century monks.
Yeah.
No, that's people who are still grieving for the loss of their core character, which is what Buddhism kind of talks about as well. It's like the idea of the relinquishing of character, stepping outside of yourself.
Yeah, it's sort of weird. It's an inquiry into sort of identity structures, and the identity structures that are sort of orienting your perception right now. Because, I mean, I suppose if you can think a lot about the conventional self, the idea that I'm I feel like a human being of a certain, gender, ethnicity, age, all sorts of personality characteristics that sort of develop over time. But it's a lot of that sort of form of self. It's a construct of memory, sort of memory that is developed over time. Because there's certain Daniel Kahneman, he has a sort of an idea of like the experiencing self and then the remembering self. And it is interesting to sort of, because a lot of meditative techniques, not just in Buddhism, but also in Zen and whatnot, is different techniques. I mean, yoga as well. I mean, yoga is sort of is the etymology of the word is sort of, I think it's derived from sort of this idea of yoking, or it's sort of some kind of building a kind of tether to wholeness, kind of. And that idea of wholeness is an interesting one, like inherently, kind of, because because a lot of our ideas of self, you know, like I said, they're built from memory, but they're also the constructions of thought as well, you know, and yeah, because it is very much thought and language that does sort of is part of how we fracture reality, you know, and systematize it. And you know, this we see this, or you know, in science across time, and you know, it's you know it's how we separate it into different things and discrete things, and then but there's also this kind of separation of ourselves as the observer from the world that can kind of happen. You know, we start to feel that, you know, or I am just this organism, and the world that I perceive, and you know, that is not me, like on a basic ontological level. But you know, if we take seriously, you know, quantum entanglement and whatever, that blurs the lines. If you consider how moment to moment, you know, you are in a constant state of flux. You know, I don't know how many sort of years it takes for example, your cells to have, you know, turned over such that, you know, much of your organism is different in structure from how it was. And I mean, the contemplation of change over time, of impermanence, you know, the central aspect of Buddhism, and it sort of, you know, it does very confront you with, you know, the I don't know, the strangeness of what's going on moment to moment, kind of, because we are all just, you know, the universe experiencing itself from, you know, a different kind of locus, a different perspective, kind of, and you know, your perception, your immediate perception, is almost it's a coalescence of billions of years of evolutionary forces, you know, unique heritages of the evolution of life, which, you know, you know, understanding that process, you know, it can very much lead you to just awe at this moment, the fact that, like, whoa, I am, you know, this organism of radical complexity, you know, with the capacity to think conceptually, to all these sorts of stuff. And you know, it's seeing the wonder in that, as opposed to being sort of caught up in a, you know, a depressive spiral where your thought becomes so ossified into a particular pattern. I mean, a lot of mental disorders are the sort of defined by the sort of rigidity of thought that you can't step out of, you know, and it's a rigidity of thought which narrows your perception, it narrows yourself. And then it's like, and you know, of course, you know, it's weird how it's sort of with Buddhism, you know, one of the central ideas is the notion of emptiness, which sounds almost, often as it's sort of presented, it's like, sounds almost nihilistic. It's so like, oh, the reality is empty, or reality is nothingness, for example. But it's more saying that, like, you know, reality is ultimately empty of any property or idea that we assign to it. You know, it's void of all those concepts. It's like that, you know, when it's like any sort of thing you say about reality, you have to almost pull it back and say, actually, it's not quite that, because it's, you know, it's like the difference between, like, the sort of the map and the terrain, for example. And all our concepts and words, they are aspects of our map that we're trying to approximate, you know, baseline reality, whatever that is. But and they help, and they're useful very much on a pragmatic level. But, you know, it's important to it's important to note that distinction between the map and the terrain. And I feel like all we can say about the terrain of reality is that maybe it just is, you know, it's that raw isness, kind of, that you are by virtue of simply being, you know, and there's nothing you need to do to achieve that or be in that state, because you are already that state, you know. And sort of, this of course ties into sort of a lot of stuff relating to, you know, certain meditative bodies of thought, you know, certain ideas about meditation. You know, often meditation is depicted, particularly in the West, it's an activity that the separate self, that you do, you know. And and then people will sit down to meditate and find, am I doing it right? And then often people will get all sorts of, the spontaneous mind will sort of start thinking about, random thoughts that you'd had, embarrassing thing you did a few years ago, or what you got to do, or all that sort of stuff. And it's like, and but people, the way that meditation is sometimes presented is, I think maybe it's like our sort of mind, particularly in very individualist sort of capitalist productive economies, we live very much in this sort of willful, active state of engagement in the world, in terms of we go out there and we do stuff, and there's not as much emphasis on the more passive aspects of mind in terms of sort of, allowing stuff allowing stuff to just be as they are, going with the flow, sort of trying to, there's an interesting idea in Taoism of Wu Wei, of the idea of like effortless action. And and I think it's like, it's a double-edged sort of action, because you wouldn't want passivity to spill over into just a kind of detachment from the world and detachment from reality, but then like being too willful and forceful within action and stuff like that. It's a seesaw, and yeah, I suppose sort of like if you sort of think about meditation as essence, it's a kind of doing nothing. It's a negation of doing anything. It's a negation of all the sort of structures of thought. You'll sit down to just be with what is, and then all sorts of stuff will come up and stuff like that. And it's, I don't know, maybe it's sort of, it's the most intimate thing you can do, but it's not necessarily like, people can enter meditative kind of states. Maybe you can call them non-dual states, for example, non-dual, but because it's a state of experience where the feeling of separateness, of being a me and a not me, you're not fixated on that, and you're just flowing with it, and there's a kind of ego dissolved kind of state. And people have it sometimes, say when you're lost in a movie, you're lost in anything, you've taken some psychedelics, some people feel it when they're playing music, doing sports or whatever. And it's a very inherently meaningful and intrinsically pleasurable kind of mode of consciousness to exist from, kind of. And and I think like the flow state, as it's sort of, it's just, there's a book by a sort of a kind of psychologist from like, I think the 70s or 80s, who's got an impossible to pronounce sort of surname, so I won't try and pronounce it at the moment. It's like Chick sent me high or something, but I maybe butchered that, where he sort of introduces this idea of the flow state. And I find it sort of, it, in my own sort of experience, it's certainly sort of meditative techniques have enabled a greater sort of, I suppose, the ability to sort of to go into those sort of states of consciousness, or notice the sort of the signs of it, when you're sort of going into it. And yeah, maybe tangented away from what we were talking about earlier, but yeah, there's many different, I guess, sort of almost like the spectrum of consciousness is, it's on the face of it an interesting thing to contemplate, not just within how your consciousness changes over the day, over your own life, or how consciousness varies between different people, between different organisms. And say when we get into Lovecraftian horror and its mythology of different entities, take an octopus as consciousness. You have no idea what they could possibly be, representing. And then, when you take the potential experience of these otherworldly and possibly transcendental kind of entities, you always reach that point where you just can't possibly imagine, what they are, what they're like, what they're thinking. you can't even ascribe the sort of the common mental characteristics that we have from human beings, you know, kind of ascribe it to that. And I think that ties very much into, particularly with artificial intelligence, as that. I mean, I almost sort of think, you know, we're almost creating the next aliens with our technological advancements. Not as like a literalistic kind of interpretation of what artificial general intelligence would be, but you know, we do have to sort of contemplate that. I mean, already we're in that sort of black box state of, you know, oh, there is some computational process that is happening, and the output, it will output some kind of thing, you know, answer or whatever. But you know, we're already at that point where we can't quite fully comprehend I mean, we can't even fully comprehend our own neural processing and our own brains and how they produce our consciousness and produce thoughts and whatnot. And you know, we'll reach that point with AGI and stuff like that. And and you know, say for example, you know, what if we created an AGI, asked it some philosophical question, and it came back with, say, anti-natalism is true, or nihilism is true, or it's like the whole idea of sort of when you have entities where their cognitive and sort of their cognitive capacities so far supersede our own ones that we can't even comprehend. Because I mean, we comprehend things often on our own relative time scale and stuff like that. You know, we can't zoom out and enter the sort of the perspective of an entity of just absurdly high cognitive capacity, and we can't particularly comprehend how they would perceive reality, for example, you know. And cause I guess, you know, from a sort of a basic scientific viewpoint and stuff like that, when you zoom out and look at the evolution of life, look at reality from, you know, more of a cosmic or maybe perhaps godlike scale, you know, it's, you know, evolution is often this very brutal principle of, you know, there's been so many mass extinction events. There is a sort of this principle of, you know, this kind of, the laws of nature do not care about you, kind of, in that sort of sense, you know. And in that sort of, and there's almost like this sort of this raw mechanical necessity of those sort of laws and of their kind of indifference. And I guess it sort of, you know, ties into sort of ideas of like the problem of evil, and you know, why is there a world with so much suffering and whatnot? What sort of, if there is a God, you know, what sort of creator would create such a thing, you know?
Yeah.
Or you know, and you know, it's sort of, because some people, you know, sometimes nihilism or say anti-theism, for example, it's almost a sort of looking at the sort of the divine and with a kind of resentment for the fact that, you know, life is this way, kind of, you know. And you know, it's you know, how do we morally condemn, you know, entities that are of a kind of complexity that so far supersedes us? Is it possible for us to condemn them, you know? If, you know, it's I don't know.
It'd be like trying to condemn a shark, I suppose, or as you said, an octopus. They are something other than us, but rather than the shark being less cognitively able than a human, these things are cognitively able to memorize all of recorded history and probably memorize it in a way where they can remember every single instant at once and not get overloaded by it. And when you get to that stage, it is a weird understanding of such creatures who could be so beyond humanity. And to them, would even a concept of nihilism even exist? Would they even, would they look upon humans and think them sort of weak for being nihilistic and broken and upset at the fact that the universe has quote unquote no meaning? Would they even consider humans at all?
Mm.
Would they even have a moral compass with which to judge us? Or are they purely beings based on logic and intuition?
Mm. Yeah, yeah. I guess it's, all we can do is kind of scratch at that sort of surface, and I suppose we have to sort of understand that, there is some kind of insurpassable kind of limit, in the sense that, obviously I can't imagine what reality is like from your perception. There's I only see the sort of the footprints of your conscious inner life, from my own representations. And of course I can infer a lot about, what you think and what your experience might be like from your resemblance, your similarity, But of course, when we're confronted with profoundly other entities, you know, it's yeah, it's
Mm.
yeah, it's I guess sort of, the perception of entities is of course something that comes up a lot in, shamanic culture, psychedelic use, for example. And I mean, the shamanic use of psychedelics is sort of the ritualistic use of certain techniques, whether it's hallucinogens, drumming, or sleep deprivation, or any kind of technique to sort of to enable one to enter sort of this trance state of consciousness. And in a sort of this trance-like, perhaps flowy state of consciousness, that is when they sort of presumably would be able to convene with, what they would interpret as, say, spirit entities or ancestor spirits, or sort of like entities or energies in the environment, which in a sort of conventional sort of waking kind of consciousness, you're sort of dissociated from them, kind of.
Absolutely.
And I think it's something that very much crops up a lot in the clinical trials that they do with psychedelics, is, and particularly with dimethyltryptamine, which is renowned for its capacity to induce sort of these mystical states of consciousness, where I don't know the specific, where a lot of the participants will tend to report an encounter with some kind of otherworldly, transcendent kind of entity or presence.
Machine elves.
Yeah, as Terence McKenna
Yes.
famously coined them. And I mean, of course, I mean, DMT is not, there are different variants of DMT. I mean that, you have NM dimethyltryptamine, which is the one which tends to induce sort of more of the visionary kind of states of otherworldly entities, otherworldly dimensions. I mean, another one variant I'm quite interested in is like 5-MeO DMT, which is much less. You don't tend to get the visions of other worlds and stuff like that. It's very much what I mean, I've not personally consumed it, so I don't know specifically. There's mainly from what I've read and stuff like that. It tends to induce more of the ego dissolved, non-dual kind of state where the sense of separation from the world is totally dissolved. And people sometimes report that, a blinding white light. There doesn't tend to be much visual content within the experience. It's very much a sort of a very unity kind of experience.
Yeah.
And that's very similar to sort of some of the states that tend to be reported can be induced through meditative techniques. The idea of like samadhi, enlightenment, the state of no self. There's so many different sort of different depictions of this sort of mystical state of consciousness, but that if you try and extract out sort of the commonalities of it to try and form, a perennial philosophy, as sort of Aldous Huxley is quite known for. I mean, I recommend anyone, The Dorsal Perception is like a fantastic sort of book if people, for just his ability to capture and describe the psychedelic experience. I mean, he didn't use psychedelics a huge amount over his lifetime, but and I don't know. I mean, he's describing mescaline in that book, and it was like one of the first few times that he did it. But his ability to sort of describe it with such clarity, and of course he was informed by a lot of like Eastern philosophy, which I think is very good for providing a sort of an orienting framework for understanding what is happening to your perception, I suppose, because it's sort of the sort of commonalities between the sort of the flow state to the mystical state is, I don't know, it feels like sort of a deep state of presence, and in order to achieve deeper states of presence or deeper states of, I don't know, coupling with whatever it is, reality or whatever it is, it's a kind of unlearning, it's a kind of defabrication of I don't know, it's a defabrication of the things that typically grab at your attention, maybe. I mean, attention is very much, it's a big component of how we structure reality, kind of, it's how we structure and discriminate stuff, prioritize what's important and what's not important. And as sort of organisms, we always have to have that sort of a kind of ability to distinguish what is relevant and irrelevant, and consequently over time, billions of years of evolution and stuff like that, we exist in a spatio-temporal kind of experienced environment. We feel like an agent within an environment, and that is our reality, being sort of evolved beings, and our attention is a kind of spotlight that sort of navigates around it, sort of, attention is sort of, it's a very deep part of that engagement with reality, and it ties into sort of, you can take attention to not just be something that is in the moment right now, but as also something that you can extend over time. Attention in terms of the things in your life that you apply time to or assign importance to. And then I guess to sort of come back to sort of meditation and stuff like that, that's sort of the application of attention to just pure presence, just raw isness, to a primordial state of being, kind of. And it's interesting that, I mean, often at the very start of doing any kind of meditative practice, of just trying to attend to, say, the breath, as it's often used, or whatever. The breath is a very because it is always there, and we have sort of semi-voluntary kind of control over it. It's a very deep aspect of our being as organisms. I mean, we're all breathing, we're all respiring and stuff like that, and it's interesting as well with the breath. You can modulate your experience, you can quicken it to put yourself in a more amped up state, or slow it down to bring yourself into a more calmer parasympathetic state. And yeah, when you're sort of just there with your breath, for example, you might find your mind jumping into imagination and stuff. And it's like we have sort of the imagination is it's a fascinating sort of capacity that we have, and it's like that sense of how your attention will just get distracted, it will just flicker into it, and you don't necessarily will that. It just it's like daydreaming, it just happens, you just slip into it effortlessly. But then you can come back, and or you can notice when your mind has flickered, and it's always like there's this sort of, maybe you can call it sort of a meta attention. It's an attention to attention that you know, yeah, it's interesting to sort of think about what is that exactly. What is that process of like recursive attention? Because of course, like, you know, I mean, maybe it's, you know, obviously animals probably aren't meditating in that sort of similar way, or maybe they don't even need to meditate because they're already just very there with what is, kind of. It seems that like human consciousness, with our sort of, particularly with our capacity to get so lost in thought, lost in imagination, to torture ourselves with our imagination as well. You know, some meditation or any sort of mindfulness kind of practice of, you know, paying attention to attention. But that does seem very much sort of, for me at least, the antidote of a lot of like unnecessary suffering. You know, it's not that I do not still suffer, but rather it's like, you know, when there is still suffering, you know, I can move my attention to it, or there can be attention with that suffering in such a way that doesn't seek to transform or change it or get rid of it. It can be with it, you know.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's attention is sort of, I mean, yeah, I don't know what more to say about it. It's very much sort of a mysterious thing for me.
It is. What's actually really interesting about that is my mum found this out a while ago. She put this in her book as well, and this what actually really helped me when it came to with my autism, sensory overload. Like, as you say, when the thing you can return to is always the breath, but turns out there's a really weird and really interesting reason for it. In the lower nodes of your lungs, there are actual neuron pathways or whatever that recognize when a breath reaches to the bottom, and they specifically are designed to shut off the overactive the overreaction of the amygdala, the fight or flight part of the brain, and it returns the brain to the higher functions of the brain. It returns power to the higher functions of consciousness. And because if you're running from a predator, your breath will be quickened and heightened, whereas once you've escaped the predator, you can finally breathe, and that is a biological mechanism designed to shut off the fight or flight mechanism of the brain. Really weird. I mean, I didn't know. I known for years that it's you're supposed to focus on your breath and take deep breaths, and that'll calm you down. But I'd never realized that that was the reason why for it. And it's also interesting. But on another note, it's interesting what you're saying about this notion of wholeness. Of you've got to, as you say, there are facets of your being which are still important to you, but they're the sort of the thing that's on top. But there is something beyond that, which is a sort of a core, and which funnels down to something immutable and eternal, whether you want to call it the soul, or the endless connection of humanity, or the universe, so on and so forth. But what that kind of makes me think of is, well, as I said before, the hierarchy of sun to flower. The flowers rise up all because of the sun. They are not the sun. If you take away the flowers, the sun will still be there, but at the same time, it's not so much living without the flowers. You've just got to realize the flowers are merely a byproduct of the central thing that's given them rise. And when you realize that, it's not that you disregard them, like getting rid of characters, not necessarily, it's not disregarding your characteristics and your idiosyncrasies and so on and so forth. It's just realizing that there's something more beyond that, and then going beyond that, you've got to live with all of them in tandem, as you said, trying to reach a wholeness between each of your facets.
Mm. Yeah, and this sort of, I think that's sort of an interesting thing that I think maybe science is sort of coming up against this, and it's been a sort of a constant facet of it, I suppose. It's like the relationship between parts and wholes, and the idea that, like, there is a sort of, there is a sense that, that everything just is, and it is all the process. Nature is almost defined by processes, and these processes are sort of processes and relationships, rather than sort of, say, the sort of perhaps the more Newtonian kind of perspective of reality composed of discrete substances that are stable. Like, for example, we think of, say, a phone as a sort of a stable substance, but of course when you zoom in on stuff, you realize that there is flux and change going on over time, in your own organism is a more complex kind of example. And like, when you think of how processes and change are almost like the primary kind of thing, and it's all kind of an entangled flux, that's, I feel like when I sort of contemplate that, it brings me experientially into the sort of a state of undifferentiation, if that makes sense, like, and how the raw isness of experience is undifferentiated, kind of, and it's but then it's like you can come from that movement of wholeness, but there is still some utility to thinking and systematizing and using abstract concepts and parsing the world into things and stuff like that. But we should, it's important not to lose sight of the fact, because you lose sight of the original fact of wholeness. Or it's a difficult one that I'm still trying to grapple with, kind of, and and I think, like, another point I wanted sort of to sort of think about was and this ties back to, of course, what we're talking about with, like, the breathing and the breath, and how the breath can alter one's not just their physiology but also their experience by one wants to calm down after, say, engagement with a predator, for example. I mean, another and as well, like, another interesting thing is, like, when people sort of crying, for example, you can sort of see that their breathing rhythm often changes, that they'll tend to take 2 quick inhales and stuff like that, and a long exhale, for example, which is called, like, a parasympathetic sigh. It's like the fancy word. It's sort of this sort of breathing rhythm of 2 inhales through the nose and then a long exhale, sort of. It's a pattern that there's some sort of neurophysiological process of, of course, relating to, like, the nerves in your lungs, which can detect how you're breathing and whatnot. But it does there's a technique that does lower your your heart rate, your blood pressure, to move you into a more relaxed kind of state. But it's interesting that when people are crying and stuff like that, if you watch how they're breathing, for example, you'll see that unconsciously they'll be breathing like that. You can sort of imagine when people are sobbing, they do tend to be breathing in a different sort of manner, and it's all sort of homeostatic regulation, I guess, regulating to sort of bring one back into sort of an equilibrium. But the point I was making before I went on that little tangent was sort of drawing on there's this, psychologist Stan Groff, who is very famous for sort of doing lots of LSD psychotherapy. He's very much like a pioneer in the sort of of using LSD for talk therapy, and he sort of like he sort of created this sort of idea of like holotropic breath work, and which is the use of certain breathing techniques to take one into sort of altered states of consciousness. And I mean, the word holotropic, it's literally means like the movement towards wholeness, and it's the notion that, of course, that through a certain style of breathing, one can move to a more a more intimately experienced state of wholeness, kind of. Because I think we shouldn't think of like wholeness as something outside that one needs to enter into. It's more that you are already there. It's always, there is already the radiant sky, to use a metaphor, but it can become clouded, to make it so that the light that pierces through doesn't seem as obviously apparent, kind of. And but it is always there. I mean, a famous thing that I always think about from Buddhism is that it's a statement that the original mind is the Buddha mind, and it's almost like the path of enlightenment is almost a non-path. It's almost such a simplicity that one fails to notice it, not because of that it's so complex, that it's so far beyond one's idea of understanding. It's it's almost like it's right in front of your nose that you miss it.
Yeah.
It's just like but but gosh, we've been talking for quite a while already. But
oh my God, yeah, look.
Yeah.
Well, time flies when you're talking about Lovecraft, psychedelics, and Bill Hicks.
Yeah, gosh, and I feel like there's already plenty more to discuss.
There is, but
part two,
perhaps another time or whatever. Yeah, but I really enjoyed this. I have to say, I think you're a really interesting guy, and like, this is some of my favorite topics to, like, I talk about in general, or just like listen to in general as well. I love talking about this or listening to this on podcast. It's just can I just say it's just been a real honor to be in a conversation with you about this on your channel.
No, likewise, I've very much enjoyed this, and like I look forward very much to future discussions as well. Because like I say, like these are all the stuff that I can't even put into words sort of my appreciation for a lot of these sort of stuff. And I'd like to thank you as well for I think as well you've sort of spurred my own interest in Lovecraft, and I feel like there's a whole rabbit hole that I'm just staring at I'm standing at the door of that rabbit hole right now. So it's
you're.
So thank you for pulling me into that.
It's a long way down that rabbit hole. It goes quite a way, but you won't regret any of it. It's some of the most interesting, not just horror. It's kind of the most interesting science fiction, fantasy literature you'll ever find.
Yeah.
Each of the stories is like a landmark on the road of just this one man's mind as he goes through his very interesting but very tragic and short life, really. And it's kind of like even some of the older stories, which are the ones you don't want to read so much because they're pretty not got the best morality to them. Just the concept of them in relation to later ones, they're just really interesting ways at looking at the way a man changed, grew, matured, and withered away over time. It's just really cool stuff. And of course, like loads of them really tie into like very psychedelic stuff, even to the point of, say, cosmic cosmic entities like the machine elves. Like the machine elves are like totally something out of a Lovecraftian story, and there are I think stories in there of people who take mind-altering substances in order to cross boundaries and so on and so forth. And in fact, an entire selection of his stories, the dream cycle stories, are based entirely about going down the rabbit hole of dreams and expanding consciousness by stepping out of one's body and going into the vast collective unconscious where everyone exists, where they go to sleep, where every dormant mind interacts with one another, and where the unimaginable and the insane become reality.
Yeah, gosh. I mean,
So yeah, light read.
Yeah, it's already spurring lots of thoughts about, you know, Jungian and Freudian almost dream analysis and stuff.
Yeah.
And yeah, gosh, I mean, the dreams. I remember sort of, you know, getting a little bit into sort of like dream interpretation, and particularly like lucid dreaming, for example, which is almost like trying to cultivate techniques to be a more conscious observer in your dreams. And I mean, I've not been able to I mean, I've only been able to have slipped into a lucid state once or twice when I was like much younger and stuff like that. But yeah, it's it does seem that there are, definitely techniques, yoga. I mean, there are certain schools of yoga, for example, that, involve sort of like, being able to become conscious in your dreams and stuff like that. And
I don't know if I've it's weird. I don't know if I've become lucid, but I become very active in a strange way, Sometimes it's strange. At one point in a dream, for some reason connected to the dream, I was supposed to sing a Smith song of my choice. And I remember making the decision of which one to sing, and I actually woke myself up by shouting the lyrics as I was coming awake. I mean, out of all the things to do in a fluke like lucid dream, which I think was like 5 years ago now, that's I don't know. Probably would have rather fought a dragon with a sword or something like that. It's a bit of a weird. It's like out of all the things to do, out of a fluke lucid dream, concert.
Yeah, yeah, no. I mean, I think I remember one lucid dream I had. I sort of, I think I was in some kind of city environment for some reason, and I don't know, some absurd things had happened, and for some reason in the dream, my dream avatar had the thought, "Oh, this is a dream," and then naturally I just started flying, as you do when you realize you're in a dream, and then you get so excited that you just wake up and you're like, "Fuck," why did that happen?
Yeah.
Hey,
It's like as soon as you realize you're in a dream, just on go the sunglasses and the long black duster, and Rage Against the Machine starts playing, and you start going.
Yeah, literally.
Like the Matrix.
Yeah, it's something that like it does interest me. Like and I remember like playing around with it years ago, before I found say psychedelics as a more interesting way to play with your consciousness and stuff. But I remember sort of going try experiment a bit with like techniques of say waking up a few hours before your normal wake up time, and trying to sort of watch yourself falling asleep kind of. And if anything, it's almost I mean as a general sort of meditative technique, just watching yourself fall asleep and trying to maintain a kind of a certain level of awareness as your body is slipping off into a more state of relaxation and repair and whatnot. That's quite an interesting experience. It can get a little bit weird quite quickly,
Yeah.
And
actually, now I think about it, I had a weird dream experience last night. I'd almost forgotten about it, but like I have nightmares quite frequently, but one of the things that happens sometimes is I wake myself up and then I fall back to sleep, and it picks up exactly where it left off. And sometimes whatever is tormenting me in it says, "Well, welcome back. Let's get on with it," or something like that. But like last night, I don't know what it was. that caused me to think this, but I had a dream. I was at the top of like an inflatable slide, which was about to go down into some sort of green jelly of some sort. But it was like it was 100 feet high and a really steep incline. And I
Mm.
started saying, I don't want to do this. And there was some really unpleasant attendant there who's saying, "Look, you're up here now, you're going to go down it." And I said to her, I have autism, I'm really stressed. She started picking me up by the shoulder and started dragging me over. I just forced myself to wake up. And then I closed my eyes briefly, and then it was her face just staring at me again. And then I felt myself going back to sleep as I was getting pulled
Mm.
about. And so I actively got up and I sat up and I wouldn't go and I did not go back to sleep because I did not want to that dream to play out. I was it was a I did not want it to play out. Don't think anything would have happened, but at the same time, it was such an unpleasant thing for the dream to reoccur, to reprise itself so immediately that I actually refused to go back to sleep, even though it was 5 in the morning. I just went, right, I'm getting up. I am watching a Wendigoon video or some comparable. Right, his latest cryptid iceberg videos come out. I'm going to see him have a go at Loch Ness Monster now, because for some reason he doesn't like the Loch Ness Monster. I don't know why, but I like the guy anyway. He's but yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I don't like it when that happens, and I think at the core of it, I really want myself I really want to look more into uh uh study of how to behave in dreams and how to not not so much how to learn how to lucid dream, but how to at least learn how to change the dream,
Mm.
because my dreams are quite frequently genuinely horrifying,
Mm.
to the
Yeah.
point of extreme of cold sweats and refusing to go back to sleep because it's such an unpleasant experience.
Mm.
So yeah.
Yeah. I think sort of. I mean. I mean, humans in general sort of. There is often the sort of the statement that we have like a negativity bias, and
Mm,
that almost plays out in how our dreams can often be skewed towards towards say the representation of primordial fears and do tend to be more. I mean it's going to be different for each individual. Some people may have tend to have you know more blissful kind of dreams. Some people may just cease to remember their dreams very often at all, and whereas other people will have crippling sort of night terrors. And you know it's weird sort of our unconscious has is sort of such a profoundly deep repository of just strangeness sometimes. And I think sort of it's interesting the sort of there are sort of connections between the sort of the unpredictability of dreams, of course, to the unpredictability of psychedelic experiences. And
yeah.
it's and of course there are sort of ways of sort of guiding the experience of a psychedelic. There are ways of you know controlling the environment in such a way to sort of orient the trip or to orient one's experience. But of course, an often refrain you hear is the relinquishing control. Relinquishing a sort of that presence within you to change the thing or to change whatever's going on is often advised. And so like when you're sort of confronting say negative feelings, sort of cosmic fear or terror or anguish or whatever, there's a kind of sense that the more you try and push at it, um it's that can just build more resistance. And often
Mm,
it's like if you're able to sort of be with it or just hold it in your experience, I mean, things can very quickly, you know, on psychedelics, things can change very quickly. You can change from states of anxiety, profound anxiety, to just relaxing to bliss, just like that, kind of. When you just let go, it's like the letting go of being a separate thing. When you're just becoming, you know, isness, or the processes of reality unfolding through you. There's a, maybe you can call it a quiet bliss, or a quiet joy, or it's not like, maybe it's not a euphoria, but it's like, I don't know, you're just there with it. But it's that's, you know, it follows from that sort of letting go. And I mean, of course, there are sort of differences between, you know, psychedelic trips and like experiences and dreaming and stuff like that. But from what I understand from, like, you know, from people who use like lucid dreaming as a way of exploring their consciousness, you know, to get over certain traumas or fears, or to just for exploratory kind of purposes. I think one sort of technique that I heard someone describe was that when he become lucid in a dream, he would, you know, when you become lucid in the dream, you almost get this capacity to, you know, modulate the dream experience or the dreamscape with one's sort of mental intentions. So you can almost sort of like will in your dream a representation of your shadow, or a representation of, you know, a certain trauma or something like that, and that way may manifest as a sort of menacing, nefarious kind of figure. And like part of the sort of the technique of getting over that fear, that trauma, or that terror, is being able to sort of confront and be with that thing, whatever your mind represents for yourself in the dream, and to be with it. And, you know, it's because like it's because, of course, like, it takes a lot of courage to do that, and there is that sort of resistance. But like, I think there's a sort of you know, from being able to be with all those negative, uncomfortable, and terrifying things in your mind, to be with it, and knowing that you can be with it and not wither away, but actually almost become stronger, kind of, or more capable, kind of. You know, it's you know, yeah, I mean, this dreams are a very deep aspect of our psyche, and yeah, I mean, I'm unfortunate that I don't tend to remember too much of my dreams. You know, sometimes I do, but it's definitely an area of my psyche that I probably, you know, I would like to explore it more, because I think you can learn a lot there. But
absolutely.
yeah. But yeah, golly gosh, we went on another tangent, but it was
wow, yeah,
it was a very worthwhile tangent.
Very worthwhile tangent. But yeah, shall we what's it give our outros and stuff?
I think so. Yeah, I guess so. Well,
Let's go.
yeah. I guess sort of like for listeners, you want to like leave the name of your YouTube channel, and of course,
Oh
like,
yes.
where people can find you.
My YouTube channel, I have two. The Isopian, which is ISOPIAN Chronicles, which is my fancy lore series, and then there's my other YouTube channel, which is just my myself, which is, rather than fancy lore, it's more general, short, either music videos or a short horror film that I'm making will go up there soon. Not the one I mentioned, but another one, an M.R. James one, as opposed to a more cosmic horror-y one, more of classic ghost story. And this one is just Elliot, Elliot, Stannard, Stannard. And both of those are on YouTube. Also, the book my mum wrote, which has basically kind of been the cornerstone of a lot of my understanding of things to do with Buddhism, mindfulness, and all that sort of thing also really helped me with overcome my autism, is called The Science Behind Wisdom. I can't remember what I can't remember what I think she just I can't remember what name she put on it, if she used a nom de plume or if she used her full name, which is Carmel Stannard. But I will get back to you on that one, and if if you're so inclined, could you type that in the old description?
Of course. Yeah, no, I highly encourage anyone to go and, I certainly will be listening to many of your stuff. I quite look forward to it. And as well, like, yeah, your mum's book, it sounds, very much right up my street, sort of converging on my interests. It's
Oh,
yeah,
that's great.
no, I'm very
Thanks.
much, yeah, and yeah,
Thank you
no,
so much, mate. It was really wonderful chatting to you. I
yeah,
hope the guys in YouTube land enjoy our conversation as much as I've enjoyed our conversation,
the
and
algorithm
hope to see you
gods,
soon.
hopefully. Yeah, no, of course, pleasure. Yeah, no, it's been a delight, and I look forward to our next conversation. Of course, yeah.
Cheerio,
Adios, my
mate.
friend. Have a good rest of your evening.
You too.
Yeah,
Bye-bye, and happy
adios.
Easter.
Yeah, thank you, pleasure. Blah 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 blah.
Wubba lubba dub dub.